It's April and it's Autism Acceptance Month. And here at the Special Report, we are here for it. This month used to be known as Autism Awareness Month, but Paula Durbin Westby, an autistic disability rights activist, started Autism Acceptance Month to move the conversation away from finding a cure to celebrating neurodiversity. This is a positive step towards change, but more, lots more, needs to be done to acknowledge the intersectionality of autism, race, and the fight for racial justice. My guests today are all leading the charge in that fight. You'll meet them coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
It's well documented that Black people on the autism spectrum do not receive as high a level of care as their white counterparts. The racial disparities in healthcare to Black and Hispanic communities are significant, and their access to care can be further diminished when you factor in socioeconomics. Structural and systemic racism contribute to the delays in diagnosis in the form of limited access to education, employment, community resources, and healthcare. A 2020 study shows that after Black parents recognize a developmental delay with their child, it can take an average of 3 years to receive an autism spectrum diagnosis. That means missing an important window to timely access to intervention therapies. In fact, white children are 19% more likely to receive an autism spectrum diagnosis than Black children. Well, white children, yes, are 19% more likely to receive an autism diagnosis than Black children, and 65% more likely than their Hispanic peers. Now, despite these incredible obstacles, some African Americans on the autism spectrum are thriving. And I'm super excited to introduce you to one of those individuals this morning. My first guest is Jossie Burks Abbots. He is on the staff at Boston's Children's Hospital. He's a writer, he's a speaker, he's also an autism self-advocate. He recently published a book called My Mother's Apprentice, An Autistic's Rites of Passage. Good morning and welcome, Jossie.
Good morning, thanks for having me.
So Jossie, I want to talk a lot about this book. I had a chance to read about it some on Amazon and I know it was recently published. But first I just want to ask you about your childhood and growing up. And I know you, from your Facebook page, you are close to 50 years old.
Yeah.
So what was getting a diagnosis like when you were a child?
Well, I mean, it was hard actually, and there were a lot of missteps and misdiagnoses and a lot of missed moments. I mean, actually, my journey kind of began almost the day I was born. When at 3 days old, I was supposedly have had I might have had a seizure, and it turned blue. And then I wound up in Children's Hospital. I was born in Berkeley, California. And I don't remember much about what happened during this time, but my development was very uneven. Like I was even kicked out of a Montessori school. And then actually around this time, I was diagnosed as mentally retarded. And that diagnosis would be rescinded later when it was turned out that I had had an ear infection during the exam, but I was still considered disabled. And actually, I began classes in regular classes, and then kindergarten, and then I was transferred to a special ed class in first grade, where I remained until about fourth grade, where I was partially mainstreamed, and I was completely mainstreamed in fifth grade. I actually wasn't given a definitive diagnosis of autism until I was 17. Wow. At 11, I was given a diagnosis of autism residual state by actually the same person who had diagnosed me mentally retarded. And autism residual state, I understood to mean that I was sort of in remission, but by the time I was 17, it was decided that autism was a lifelong condition and that it wasn't residual. It was you either had it or you didn't, and it had to be determined that I did have it. Because actually that was sort of when I had what I call my terrible teens, and I wound up in the psych ward of actually at UCLA, neuropsychiatric hospital in Los Angeles. And because I grew up in Southern California, where your organization is. And that's where I was finally diagnosed with infantile autism. Now, since then, I mean,
Let me stop you there, Jossie. You've just given us a lot of information. And what happened to you, we know, unfortunately, happens to a lot of African American kids, which is the misdiagnosis and lots of back and forth with doctors and doctors not really knowing what's going on. Let's start with why you were given what was then called a diagnosis of,
mental
intellectual
retardation.
disabilities. What we
Yeah,
call
now it's
that.
intellectual disability.
But
I
why
don't
were you
know
considered mentally
specifically.
retarded?
I don't know specifically why in that case, but I'm glad you brought up the back and forth because there was also the misunderstanding with teachers. In other words, the understanding when I was growing up is that I probably had some type of learning disability. So that's why I was in special ed. That's why even when I was partially mainstream, I went to the resource room. But there were some teachers who actually saw my problems as coming from other places. Like there was one teacher who wrote across the top of one of my papers when I did poorly on the math portion of a science exam, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, which was then the slogan of the United Negro College Fund. So a lot of people attributed my problems to emotional disturbance. I mean, even for instance, when I was a baby, my parents divorced when I was 2. Some people thought some of my problems were emotional problems being not being raised by a single parent. So there was a lot of you could say there was a lot of
Emotional
fault.
problems because you were being raised by a single parent.
Right, but they thought that was a problem, and they saw that as sort of me being emotionally disturbed because of it.
Wow. So you had an intellectual disability diagnosis, you had an emotional disturbance diagnosis, you had a learning disability,
Yeah.
and then you said you went through these terrible teens. What were you going through during your teenage years?
Well, I always had a quick temper, and like I would always when I was a kid, I was always being made fun of. My glasses were often broken. I was very bad in sports. I was being teased, and I was always fighting back. And sometimes I basically you could say I had a chip on my shoulder, so that even when my mom would criticize me and trying to help me, I couldn't hear what she was saying. I would just hear fight or flight response. I would argue with her, and I would have outbursts. Sometimes even disturbing the neighbors or worrying about disturbing the neighbors. And well, when I became a teenager, they got a little bit worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I even started having suicidal ideations, and it was more and started involving more people, and so that's why I finally wound up in the hospital because we thought maybe I had some emotional problems, and that's when people started talking about autism. See, actually, the year I went up in the hospital was the same year that Hans Asperger's work on autism was made available in the United States. And that's when people, at least in the United States, started talking about the autism spectrum.
So you've described a range of symptoms that doctors and teachers have looked at to try to get a definitive diagnosis. What about you caused them to believe you have autism? Obviously, you have really great language. Your cognition is incredible because we know you got a master's degree, a bachelor's degree. You teach at a children's hospital in Boston. So I don't know about your social emotional skills, but tell us, what is it that they honed in on to cause them to say that you were autistic?
It's interesting you mentioned the language, because when people started talking about Asperger's syndrome, they connected it with the language. That in essence, the language ability of autistics was because of Asperger's syndrome. But in terms of what they probably honed in on, it was probably my unevenness of skills and abilities. The fact that I was so good in certain areas and so bad in others. And also the fact that I just tend to sort of be to myself. I'm not very social, I'm not very talkative. I do have some executive function problems. I've gotten better, of course,
What about sensory? Do you have any sensory issues with light or sound or
growing up, I would have told you no, but actually thinking about it, yes. It's very interesting the way in which I sort of channeled some of my sensory challenges in other ways. So I have a very strong sense of smell. I only believe my hands are clean after I've completely washed them. Loud noises disturb me. They used to actually terrify me. Now I can, sometimes I can muffle them. Sometimes I'll put my finger in my ear, pretend like I have an ear itch to muffle it.
You mentioned executive functioning skills. Talk more about those.
Yeah, being poorly organized, not really being able to organize things, having a very hard time. Like I was always, when I was a kid, I was always losing things. Or I was always leaving homework assignments to the last minute. and paperwork has always been my Achilles heel, among other things. And,
So your ability to just kind of order your day and move through a day in an organized fashion, you've always had issues with
always,
that?
yeah, very, very difficult.
Talk about growing up. I know in your book you share the story of what it was like to be a Black boy growing up in an all-white school. Were you bullied because of that? Did you experience racial slurs? What was that like?
Well, I would say that, it was interesting being the only Black kid in my class because, see, and a lot of that was, there wasn't a lot of overt racism per se, but there were like undercurrents. There were like if I was a borderline between a B and a C, the teacher would always give me the C, for instance. Or there were often assumptions made about what I could or couldn't do. Or, for instance, like I had one particular teacher, a racist teacher in grade school who actually went up in the principal's office and had to be, if she was marking me down for assignments I actually completed, so an arrangement had to be made with the vice principal to sort of check her to make sure, to prove that I actually was doing my homework. And so I had that, but mostly, I mean, I benefited by being raised by an academic who was an English professor, but her specialty was African American literature and film. And, so she would encourage me to read, for instance, by having me in the library program at our local library. And I would read books by and about African Americans. And she was very interested in media images, how Hollywood cinema influences how people see African Americans and the impact it has on public policy. So she would talk to me for hours about current events and about I mean, some of the same conversations that we were having in 2020 about systemic racism and about implicit bias. I grew up on that, on those conversations.
And you're talking about your mom. So
my mom, yeah, my mom was always.
I'm Ruth, who you identify in the book, and the book is actually in some ways a tribute to your mom and
definitely
how
is.
she
Yeah.
helped you develop these phenomenal skills that allowed you to graduate from high school and attend college, get an undergraduate degree and a master's degree. So your mom, beautiful woman, African American woman on the cover of the book. How was she treated? Because here she is, I'm sure, getting all of these different diagnoses. Do you have any recollection of what it was like for her to be told her son was mentally retarded, that he was emotionally disturbed, that he had mental health problems? I mean, I have to imagine that was over.
What I remember, I mean, yeah, she did have that, but she also had another thing where she was often sometimes talked down to, or conversely, if she appeared to be too knowledgeable, my problems would be blamed on the fact that I was being raised by an intellectual. In other words, she was too smart, and it was bad for me. It was.
Wow. So your mom, either she was blamed for being a single mom raising you,
right,
stigmatized by that, or you said
being too educated,
being too smart,
or being too overprotective. She would get all that.
Wow. And you not only your mom Ruth, we know that you are the stepson of the legendary singer Frida Payne.
That's right. Yeah.
She's married to your dad, and you have a younger brother.
Half-brother, yeah.
Half brother as a result of her marrying your dad.
Mm-hmm.
So how has your family embraced you? Your mom, I know, has passed away. Sorry to hear about that loss pretty recently. But Frida and your dad and your brother and your extended family, what are those relationships like?
I didn't have much contact with my father. I've only seen him like twice in my life. But my half brother, Frida, and my mom were closer when we were growing up because my mom and I were not wealthy. Even though we lived in Beverly Hills, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. She slept in the living room. Frida, of course, was wealthy. And my half brother was wealthy, so I would often spend the weekends at his house sometimes in his swimming pool, because I love to swim. As we got older, we became less close, but I would say that actually it's particularly after my mom passed away. So my family basically consisted of my mom and her 2 sisters and my grandparents. My grandparents lived in New York with one of the sisters, and I had a aunt who lives in California, still lives in California. But after my mom died, my family expanded a little bit because a lot of people rallied around me and became family. So I became closer to my half brother, almost as close as we were when we were kids, and closer to my ex stepmother, and also extended family, like cousins on my grandfather's side of the family, some of the Burkeses. So yeah, I actually went to a family reunion a couple years ago in Atlanta right before the pandemic hit. One of the last trips I was able to take.
Glad to hear that. Glad that you were able to reconnect with your family. Also, Jossie, in this book, you tell this harrowing story of being diagnosed with lung cancer and being given 6 months to live. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was almost a cosmic shock, because my mom was always worried, as most parents are, about what would happen to her after it happened to me after she passed away. And actually, one strategy she had was to help me write my story. And because she was in humanities, and well, towards what would turn out to be the end of her life, she got more into the social sciences. And so she started interviewing me qualitatively and observing me. And she actually wrote an article about me that was published. And she wanted to extend this article into a book. So that's what we're going to work on. But we're also giving presentations around the country and even some foreign countries about autism, but from two different perspectives, a mother and a self-advocate. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, everything changed when she was diagnosed, and it was very quick. So there wasn't a lot of time to plan, because most of the time was dealing with, she had a lot of pain, she was sedated, but one thing that I actually like to leave parents with was how some of the plans she made beforehand actually helped me later. Not only did the community rally around me, in fact, there are two things I like to leave with parents. One is a story I read from an anthropologist named Richard Roy Grinker. He tells us, he's a medical anthropologist, and he has a child with autism. And he tells a story that he was with a tribe in the Kalahari Desert, and he was talking to parents of a child, an 8-year-old, who was nonverbal, would be considered was autistic. And he asked the father if he and his wife were concerned about what would happen to their child after they passed away. And the father looked at him kind of confused and said, "But we're all not going to die at once." Now, of course, I live in the West, more individualistic society, but I would find that there was a certain degree of that I benefited from. Like very specifically, in terms of where I live now. My mom and I lived in Avalon at Bedford Center, which is an apartment complex in Bedford, affordable housing. And when she started getting sick, we looked into me staying at Avalon Bedford Center. But unfortunately, there's an income limit, which I would fall well below. So I couldn't do that. At least that's what we thought. And so I applied to the Bedford Housing Authority, and I got a letter saying it was an 8 to 10 year waiting list.
Wow.
But a couple of months later, that 8 to 10 year waiting list shrank to just 1. I got an apartment. But then what also happened is after my mom passed away, that's when Avalon said, actually, we're going to hold an apartment aside for you and have you apply. And when I didn't make the cut, they made an exception if someone was willing to vouch for me, which one of my aunts is a financial planner, was able to do. And that's where another plan my mom had in place came in handy. She had a health insurance, a life insurance policy that my aunt took and put with her broker. And I still get income from that to this day.
Wonderful. So your mom did a lot of work to plan for you after she was gone. And that is great advice. And parents of special needs kids, yes, we are always encouraging them to think about life after they are gone, whether it's going to be a sibling or an aunt or a cousin or some family member that can help provide for that individual that has autism or that has special needs. I want to bring into this conversation now a professor, Dr. Shanter Alexander. She's a professor at Howard University. And Dr. Shanter Alexander and you are going to be on a panel tonight, actually sponsored by Howard University, called Voices from the Black Autism Community. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Alexander. I want to ask you, why this panel? Why this panel on Black individuals and the autism community, and why now at this moment?
There's a lot of discussion about social justice and what that looks like for different groups of people. The Black community, many times we talk about things like police brutality and challenges with appropriate education, but there are subgroups. And with autism, the Black community makes up a percentage of the group that is often overlooked and definitely underrepresented. So for me, this is not just a research project or just the flavor of the day. I do have a family member who is passed now, who much later in my training and experience, I discovered, oh my goodness, he had autism. And you think about the fact that there are many individuals out there who might not have information, who don't know how to access the resources, who don't necessarily understand all of the papers that are coming out. There's no one to bridge the gap and explain it. And so at Howard, the Mecca, HBCU, we want to create a safe place for our Black community. A safe place where the underrepresented subgroups like the Black autism community can come and ask questions and get redirected to resources in their areas. And we want to make sure that we are essentially the source of information, not just on the East Coast or in the DC area, but that somebody can pick up the phone or send an email and say, can you help me? Can you direct me? The literature shows that Black children are less likely to be diagnosed early, as you mentioned earlier. Not just that, in Josie's experience, not only are they diagnosed later, but they may be misdiagnosed with behavioral and social emotional issues. In fact, almost 50% of every Black child diagnosed with autism is also diagnosed with an intellectual disability. That is concerning. So there are many concerns, and you ask why now? My question is, why not now? The social justice and equity movement is blazing for several issues, and we want to make sure that our autism community is seen and their voices are heard.
No, great. And congratulations to you on that work. And as I shared with you before the show, Special Needs Network, that is the work that we have been engaged in for over a decade now on the West Coast, working at that intersection of disability rights and social justice. And in this moment where we've been having this national conversation about systemic and structural racism, particularly in not just the criminal justice system, but in the healthcare system, the autism community, the voices of African Americans and people of color definitely need to be lifted up in a much bigger way, and those voices need to be amplified. So I'm super excited to see that you are leading that charge at the Mecca, as you call it, Howard University. Yes. Until yesterday, I was feeling pretty good about my university, Harvard University, until we now got that big report that says that Harvard is Harvard because it built itself on the backs of slaves. But that's a different show that we will cover. But okay. But my friends have been kind of teasing me about Harvard versus Howard. Josie, you're a Black man. So all the things that me and the professor are just talking about in terms of criminal justice, when we think about Black men in our society today, they are in many ways under attack. They've been under attack. Have you had any experiences with law enforcement or any experiences that, mirror the bigger criminal justice issues that we've been talking about and seeing played out in the media?
I would say for the most part, my experiences, I haven't really had any experience with law enforcement per se. When I was a kid, I was accused of shoplifting at my local grocery store. And actually, the way the accusation was made was, it almost sounded like it was a joke, and I thought it was. So I smiled, but I did an autism thing before I knew I was autistic. I had this idiot grin, which almost like a Cheshire cat, and I can't control it once it starts. And that to him was like a confession that I was actually guilty. Fortunately, I had an alibi, and supposedly the manager didn't have any hard feelings, but he still put me under surveillance. A lawyer friend of my mom would come in and sort of give him a piece of her mind and sort of stop the surveillance. But my mom was always sensitive to what it was like. For instance, like I did have a friend who was into shoplifting. She was always worried that if we got caught, I would get in trouble. I mean, she's even like didn't like me walking out by myself alone at night, for instance. Just because she didn't want me to be vulnerable. She felt I was vulnerable. So,
Did your mom give you what, those of us in the Black community talk a lot about in terms of the talk?
Oh yeah, especially when I was a teenager, and we would talk about driving and being pulled over. I mean, the reason why I don't drive has not necessarily to do with that, because I just have bad visual spatial skills. My mom would drive with me. She'd say turn left, I would turn right. I mean, I was always in the wrong side. I just, my mom would say, car's a lethal weapon. It's not worth it. So, I mean, I've tried many times, and maybe I'll try again. In fact, actually, someone offered to teach me how to drive right before the pandemic hit. Well, the pandemic hit.
Well, don't give up. You obviously have accomplished so much in your life. I'm sure you can also conquer whatever is preventing you from passing that driving test. Professor Alexander, what do you hope the outcome? You've assembled. Jossie's going to be on this panel tonight. You'll be on this panel. I saw from the flyer there are a couple of nonprofit leaders in the Washington, D.C. area who are also going to join this panel. What do you hope the outcome is by having this discussion?
Yeah, to shine a light on the issues that we face as a Black community. I'm a school psychologist, and there are numerous discussions within the education system about how can we make sure that we're offering equitable services. People are asking questions about how can I advocate for my child? How can I advocate for my family? Wait list for diagnosis and screening, years, and so the end goal of this conversation that we'll be having this afternoon from different representatives, we do not claim for any of us on the panel to be the face of Black autism. It is simply a group coming together to have a conversation about shared concerns and shared challenges. The end goal is to raise this awareness, and hopefully we can invite some philanthropists to help us set up an autism center at Howard University. You can't do anything without money. And so at the moment, if we raise awareness for some of the unique challenges of the Black community, hopefully we can have some individuals saying, I want to help, I want to support this work, and we can make it create better opportunities for our people.
Great, fantastic. I do. You're right. You can't do anything without money. And that step towards raising those dollars definitely starts with addressing and calling out the problem, which is why I'm so happy, Jossie, when you were growing up, you didn't have psychologists and pediatricians and the entire clinical community around autism, standing up and saying there is structural racism, there's structural biases in the diagnosis and treatment of individuals of color on the autism spectrum. How significant is that for you as a Black man who went through this system that really just failed you in so many ways with all of these, inaccurate diagnoses?
I think it is significant to have that understanding. I mean, I would say that my mom was making me aware of these things, and my mom's work in African American literature and film was always making me aware of these things. And so, I mean, I wasn't unaware. It was just usually a dual narrative where it's like I would hear that we're in a colorblind society, but then I would also learn about how we're not in a colorblind society. So it was this dual narrative I was sort of growing up with and had to sort of reconcile. But in terms of the importance of having, you mentioned having a whole team of psychologists and pediatricians. I actually applaud that that's what's happening now. But I think back to something a psychiatrist said to me around the time I was diagnosed. He said that I benefited from not being diagnosed earlier. Of course, I vehemently objected to that because I was still bitter. But I've come to see that he sort of had a point. So like, I would like to almost see like it's kind of a Goldilocks solution where it's like you have these services and you have this understanding, but as long as you're empowering people to advocate for themselves. And that's what I almost feel like it sounds like you would be doing, giving parents the resources, and of course, finally also self-advocates the resources so that they can advocate for themselves, understand the system, know what's out there. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm learning through the LEN program, the Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, learning more about the system that actually I live within, understanding it so that I can make changes through actually storytelling. Because one of the things when we talk to legislators, it's important to tell your personal story. It's important to have facts behind you, but it's more important to tell your story.
I know, Dr. Alexander, that storytelling is also something that you like to center, or you think is important to center. Talk more about what that storytelling looks like now and what you think it should be moving towards.
Thank you. So I'll give you a personal experience that I had that changed the way that I practice. Several years ago, I was invited to do a workshop in Brooklyn, New York, just giving information about autism, and it was for a faith-based community, just sharing tips as to how they can make their church spaces, their spaces of worship, more inclusive. And one parent walked up to me and she said, you can't talk to me. And she said, I sit in rooms with experts like you, and you don't understand my story. You don't understand what it's like to feel like you are miscarrying the child that you dreamed that you would have every day. It is a grief that is pervasive and daily almost. In that moment, I spent over an hour talking with this parent of twins, both of them with autism, and I was intentional about changing the way that I conduct evaluations and screenings, because at that point, she was no longer just an individual. At that point, she was someone whose pain I had had an opportunity to hear about and learn about. I learned what caused her to breathe or to hold her breath every day. And I think as clinicians and practitioners and allies and advocates, the power of the story must be at the core of what we do. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. We have to be motivated to see each individual as powerful enough and reason enough to sustain the journey that we're on together.
Well said.
No, absolutely. I agree. Jassy, I'm glad to hear you've not had any encounters with law enforcement since that shoplifting incident as a kid. But do you have any concerns that if you were stopped by the police, in your case, probably not driving, maybe even just walking, because we've seen incidents involving people just walking and doing normal things, being confronted by the police, that maybe they wouldn't understand you, there would be some communication breakdown. Does that ever concern you?
Well, not in the town that I live in. I mean, I live in Bedford, and pretty much everyone knows me and pretty comfortable. But yeah, I could imagine if I was in a strange place that yes, people might misunderstand me, and I might be a miscommunication. And unfortunately, when we're dealing with guns, miscommunication, it's instant. You really can't. If you misunderstand what someone says, and you can say something back, but law enforcement has to act so quickly that it's like I could just see that could be a problem. Or like one thing, I don't even know if this is true, but I've heard that when the cops supposedly know you're guilty if you fall asleep in the interrogation room. And I've often thought, well, when I'm under stress, I fall asleep. So okay, that's a problem.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard that, but interesting point to make. I just want to thank both of you, Jassy. Again, his book is My Mother's Apprentice, An Autistic's Rites of Passage. Make sure you get it. It's a really compelling and warm story about African-American males' journey through this system, all the twists and turns, unfortunately not the positive twists and turns that we'd like to hear, but obviously, Jassy has done phenomenally well, double degreed, working, living independently, and writing books and speaking, and just sharing your story with the world is so important. And thank you, Dr. Alexander, for this workshop that you're going to do tonight. Tell people how they can join, because this is a virtual panel, right?
Yes, it is a virtual panel, and we do have a press release out. So on all the Howard University pages, there is a link you can scan. And even when it shows up on your screen right here, just scan that QR code and it will take you directly to the registration. We look forward to talking with you, hearing voices this afternoon. And it's just the first of many conversations we'd like to have at Howard.
Well, thank you again for leading the charge and starting those conversations, and good luck in terms of getting that center opened at Howard University. That would be absolutely positively phenomenal to have a center like that at HBCU, and obviously at one like Howard University. Folks, make sure you join this panel. It's going to be a dynamic discussion about African Americans in the autism community. Again, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Right, my next guest, she is a mother of an African-American son on the spectrum, and she's also an autism researcher. She's a doctoral candidate at UCLA, and she has a very, very interesting research project that is really centered around the struggle for Black disability justice. And I'm excited to welcome my next guest. Her name is Stephanie Keeney Parks. Good morning, Stephanie.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me today.
So Stephanie, I just talked to Jossie. Jossie is a fully grown man, super accomplished, has done so much despite his journey and his mom's journey. Tell us a little about your son, much younger, obviously, and just at the beginning of his journey in some ways, but share your son's story.
Correct. My son, Dell, is 17 years old now. He was diagnosed when he was 4, and like most, or too many Black families, rather, we had a late diagnosis and we had difficulty getting access to that. Though he displayed probably every red flag you could think of. He was nonverbal. He was walking on his toes. He hand flapped. He tantrum for hours on end. And I knew he had autism. It was just really, really hard to get clinicians to listen to us. And of course, we were really blessed. My spouse was in the military. He was Air Force. So we had excellent insurance and we had access to services, and were able to really support him and find schools that worked for him. And he's doing beautifully. He is kind and funny and smart, and he's all the things you want your children to be, right? Like a good citizen on this planet. So I ended up lucky. He's wonderful.
So is he 17? Where is he in terms of education, like school?
So he is currently at University High School in Los Angeles. Right, he's a sophomore, and he loves it. He plays the trombone and has friends and does all the things a 17-year-old should.
Stephanie, did your son have ABA therapy?
He did.
So we talked yesterday to a parent who has become a stepmom of a 12-year-old girl who was on the autism spectrum. And so she wasn't in the child's life when she was very young, but her husband had gotten a range of different therapies, but avoided ABA. And she said she was glad because she had met some adult autistic people who said ABA had been oppressive and they were traumatized by ABA. Did you have any of those negative experiences with your ABA provider?
We were extremely lucky, and I'm a mom that has a skill set that allows me to like read data, and that's what I do well. I read well, right? I'm a doctoral student. So I was able to read a lot about ABA, and I understood what I wanted and from this experience. And if I felt like a clinician even got anywhere near being aggressive or inappropriate with my child, I just fired the clinician, and I just never thought about anything else. And we centered my son's experience around things that felt good and right and appropriate for our family. But I do understand and absolutely respect the fact that many adults on the spectrum had terrifying experiences, right? ABA does come from a horrifying tradition, right? And it was in its inception abusive. But as it currently exists, there's so many various ways that it's used, right? For example, my little girl who does not have autism, but is 11, so you still have to incentivize her. We wanted her to behave appropriately at an event, and she loves comic books. And so we said, well, okay, you get through this event for mom, and then we'll go to the comic book store. You can pick out your comics, right? And that's a version of ABA because it's using what are wanted things, right? Like if you have good behavior, you get good things is basically kind of how we understand it, and it works in our family. So for us, it was a very good experience, but that's not to displace those who've had terrifying experiences, because they really have.
I know that this dissertation that you are working on over the next year and a half is really going to focus on race and how Black families in particular are crafting strategies of resistance and survival. Talk more about the dissertation. What caused you to focus on this area, and what do you expect your research to show in terms of how Black families are coping?
So my long-term research, I've been in graduate school forever, like most of us have. And my master's degree centers around Black families and the everyday life world, right? Those quiet moments in our homes where we're making dinner with our families, and how do our children interact with that? And how do we understand and kind of conceptualize autism within our family structures? And then how do we support our kids? But as COVID hit, I was watching all these organizations like yours take and move to online platforms. And as you were doing those things, Black families across the country started to be able to gain access. So, one of my favorite organizations is Autism in Black. I absolutely adore the work she does, right? And so, watching her take on these podcasts, and then families were able to join, and then doing these all Black conferences, which I know yours is this weekend and I'll be there too, but when they're online, then you can have a family in Nebraska at your conference, right? And it started to make inroads with families where they could meet across the country. And in my original research, families always talked about being so siloed and alone in this experience. And I think you and I both know this as parents, it can be really lonely at times. And the move to these online national platforms with parents running these large national organizations about Black autism has created a way for us to come together and have necessary conversations like the one at Howard this evening is imperative. Having a Mecca, having an autism center that surrounds Blackness, that is centered in Black autism research is absolutely imperative. And so these are the things I'm interested in, right? And I'm also interested in those moments like what happened for you, Areva, that made it so that you were like, I'm gonna change LA. I'm gonna make this incredible organization so that no family experiences like these inequalities, if I can control that, right? Or, what were those moments like for you that really lit that fire? And so those are things my dissertation research focuses on. And really what I found thus far is maybe not news to you, but Black moms are magic. We will really love and defend and support not only our own children, but the community's children. It's just within us. And this is a thing that we do. And it seems to be, it's just transferred into the disability world because that's what our children need. And it's not surprising, I don't think, but it's nice to have the data to support the assertion, right?
Yeah, no, I'm super excited about your dissertation because Special Needs Network is evolving. We evolved from a parent-focused parent education organization to a policy legislation to direct service. Our own clinic and our next iteration is actually a think tank and a research institute that will study these issues that we're talking about, resilience, how Black families and brown families and families of color are coping, and how we break down some of those barriers and create anti-racist models for service delivery that can be used not only in the healthcare field, but in the law enforcement field and social services and fields across this country. Because our kids, our adults, they don't just come into contact with healthcare professionals or educators. They go into the world and they come into contact with everybody. So which is why during Autism Acceptance Month, it's so important that we, help folks understand that our kids are not in silos. They're gonna, there's no disability McDonald's. It's just McDonald's. So when I walk into a McDonald's, we want that to be a positive interaction. But you mentioned moms.
Yes.
Are you studying in this work that you're doing dads? Because I have in my work encountered some phenomenal African American dads.
Yes.
I am I have pre-recorded an interview of a phenomenal dad. His name is Dr. Charles Quigless. That interview I did with him will air Saturday on my radio show, KBLA Talk 1580, Areva Martin Out Loud. This is a dad that I've known forever, grew up with in St. Louis, and he's on fire, and his passion for his son, who's on the spectrum, is incredible. But we don't hear often those voices of dads. So what are you doing about dads?
I study families as entire units. It just happens that these particular organizations that I'm interested at the moment happen to be run by moms. When I run into dads, I am so excited about this because the dads that I have in my study are exceptional. But we know this about Black dads. They're like, the data on Black dads is they're just wonderful with their children and do interact so beautifully. And so it should translate to disability, right? And it often does. Like when my spouse interacts with my son, it's one of the things that makes me love him so much, right? Is watching him love his child so thoroughly. And,
there's some statistics out there, Stephanie, that talked about high divorce rates, separation rates, and there a lot of literature that talked about dads in particular, not just Black dads, but all dads, really having difficult times accepting their children on the spectrum, because we know autism impacts boys more than girls. 4 times more boys have autism than girls. Has that changed? Have you noticed over the course, say, of the last decade, that dads are looking at autism differently? The community is thinking about dads differently because dads had a pretty bad rap. Bad reputation, and I think a lot of it was, I don't think it was fair in some ways, but what does that data show you?
My data, and I've been extremely lucky with the families I've worked with. My master's degree in particular centered on Black middle and upper middle class families who all had those traditional markers that we're all taught. Are you a 2-parent, married, home? Are you college educated? And do you have access to health insurance? And they have all these markers. If you have these things, you'll get equitable access to the American pie. That's the supposed story, right? And so many of the Black dads that I worked with were incredibly well educated, worked at high levels of the US military, at the Pentagon, would be the type of men that you could potentially stereotype as being potentially having super high expectations of having a child, right? And the child being typical. But it turns out they were brilliant and funny and kind to their babies and supportive and often extremely supportive of their wives. In fact, I did not run across a dad who wasn't supportive of their child. They talk about acceptance differently, that's for sure. For my own spouse, who's retired military, retired Air Force, he talks a lot. Our son is his namesake, right? So, and he's a third. And so being the third member of the family with this name, there was kind of this idea that he would grow up and play football. And for my husband, it was the moment when he couldn't play football with his son typically. And that's kind of how he started to process it. And where I'm a mom, I process this entirely differently. And I think, there has to be some type of grace towards this, and maybe a little gender analysis would be useful. I'm not a gender scholar, but if anybody would like to be, I'd love to help you go to graduate school. So it's important that we give a little grace here, because I do think, given the gender norms, especially within our own community, we're looking at just different ways of processing and understanding and acceptance. And I see a lot of Black men right now talking more and more about being a dad, being a girl dad, being a dad of a kid with autism, right? These various different types of acceptance that they're showing. And it's beautiful, quite frankly. It's the Black family to me is just a beautiful entity, right? So I'm likely to say that we're doing good things, because I actually think we are. But
have you seen any data on the whole divorce rate? There was some sense that those numbers of 50% of families who had kids on the spectrum ended up in divorce, that number was inflated. So there was always some skepticism about that high divorce rate number. What have you seen around that number?
I would almost question the data itself because 50% of marriages end in divorce anyways. So yes, disability can be really, really difficult for a family to navigate. And yes, you can certainly disagree on these things. It can certainly impact marriage, but I'm unsure that, the same numbers exist for things like military families divorce at extremely high rates. And I just want to be really careful around that because divorce rate is high in general. Divorce over finances is high. Divorce over military service is actually higher than disability. Divorce over a spouse going to graduate school is incredibly high, right? So, I don't want to downplay the difficulties that marriages can have when they're navigating disability and an unexpected disability with a child. That's for sure a thing, but I'm unsure that it's any different or, higher than any of these other kind of things that we're experiencing.
I know one of the things you want to do in your dissertation, Stephanie, is I read that you want to decenter white ideologies on healthcare, disability, and Black culture. What does that mean?
So I spent a year in a clinic that specializes in care for children with disabilities, and I watched how clinicians at large, so OT, PT, speech, anybody who really kind of does any medical service with a disabled family was taught to work with families. How are they taught to diagnose autism? And then I watched them actually do the work and how the families responded to the work. And one of the things that came about for me, which I was also quite surprised about, was how powerful culture and was in those spaces, right? So for example, if a Black child came in and did an autism diagnosis, but the Black child didn't code switch, right? Which we all know code switching means we're not using what is traditionally Black language, but rather code switching to what looks like a more, I hate to use this term, but kind of a white idealized understanding of what the English language is. If the child missed that mark, that inability to code switch would be then taken as a disability. Instead of like just a cultural norm in a Black household, it became, oh, well, this child's language is inappropriate, it's disruptive, it's problematic. And so that would score the autism diagnosis differently, right? So what we have to be, and I'm not arguing like whiteness is bad and Blackness is good or things like this. What I'm arguing is just that we have to be really careful and self-reflexive about that these things are, right? There are these ideas about what type of language we use that's appropriate and what isn't, right? And Black folks, when we speak within our own homes and to each other, we speak a little differently, and it can be called hood or slang or whatever it is, right? And actually, linguists don't actually believe this. We believe it to be creative and like really grammatically complex and things like that. But in a space like an autism diagnosis, it shows to doctors and clinicians who understand that to be deviant, it then gets scored as deviant, right? And so we got to really think
that those clinicians in that clinic were able to differentiate between a kid speaking the way that they may normally speak at home from that being evident of some kind of learning disability or some kind of other deficit?
Yeah, they would score things that were non-normative to white understandings of the world, like the white cultural understandings of what should be normative. If your child lies outside of that, that would be disability. So for a Black child, if you displayed Black cultural norms, that's then conflating race with disability, right? Instead of just looking at, does the child have kind of autistic traits, right? And that's really difficult because we are then facing something where a child who has an autism diagnosis, which is inherently about the social world and language use, right? Can said child assimilate into white ideas of what autism should look like, right? So they have to navigate this in a way that their white counterparts are not. And this is really, really difficult, nuanced work. I mean, I get paid to think about this all day, right? And it's hard for me. And so you can imagine a clinician in those quick moments that they have with us, how easy it is to kind of conflate these things and how hard it is for them to pull them apart and kind of figure out what's happening.
Do you see any changes, Stephanie, over the last 2 years in particular, that we've been in this kind of national conversation about dismantling structural racism? Do you see on the ground level, in clinics like the one you worked in, any changes to, because one, we have a pipeline problem. We just don't have enough minority people working in this field. We know that whether it's psychology, whether it's medicine, whether it's behavioral health, it's just the numbers are horrible. Yes. And we're not going to be able to change them overnight because, to get into these fields, it takes a high school diploma, it takes a college degree, it takes a master's or, more advanced degree. So there's a pipeline, it's like a 10-year cycle before we can really grow those numbers. But are you seeing changes in trying to at least help those clinicians that are working now in the field, get a better understanding? And beyond these kind of like, I took an implicit bias class online for an hour or not,
Right. Absolutely.
Now I'm a certified culturally competent clinician, not that.
Yes. And I actually hate the word cultural competence because I feel like there's no way to be competent in another person's culture, right? I prefer things like just marking the fact that like even cultural humilities, so you can be humble about the fact that somebody is different from you and maybe you should just pay some extra careful attention to that, right? But I think there has been there's been this movement where people are more aware that this is necessary, right? That we have to change what we're doing. Has it actually happened? Mm-hmm. I'm unsure. But I do think there is an awareness and a potential willingness that didn't exist 2 years ago to kind of engage medical care and race and disability and kind of the intersections of all these different identities as a way to like make healthcare better. And the willingness might exist, but I'm unsure the actual movement has happened, right?
So Dr. Alexander, I know this is your kind of area of expertise. So jump back in. You work on the ground. School psychology.
I mean, right on point with what you're talking about, with simple like code switching. I think a lot of the field does not understand that this is really an ecological issue. You've got to know the people, understand the people, and a lot of the assessments that are currently being used were not normed on minority populations, right? So when you're looking at a language-based disorder or condition.
Yesterday on the show, I had a woman named Catherine Lord. She is a big wig at UCLA. You may know her. She said that those tests, she agreed that when you get to the adolescent and older kids, those norms and traditions you're talking about come into play. But she said not so much for the kids. Would you two professionals disagree with that?
Yes. Immediately.
Well, I'm on the borderline with that. I think you look at the big picture, and I have tremendous respect for Dr. Lord's work. In fact, we all use it.
Instruments.
Yes. So I think that the global issue here is, as more individuals are being missed in those early screening stages, and we're getting into those adolescent and adulthood stages, then how are our tools designed to capture those that were missed in the early stages? And I think that's a conversation that we are having and continue to have amongst the clinical teams and the practitioners. How culturally responsive are our assessment and screening tools? And at Howard, we actually have a course in culturally responsive cognitive assessment. Are we really understanding the code switching and the terminology and the environments that Black and Brown and other identities groups are living in, and how are we tailoring the services to meet that? I mean, we can go on and on, Areva, but you can see how excited I am about this. This is necessary for us to have conversations about.
And I think to add to this, like,
absolutely,
yes, and talking to you is so wonderful to talk to a Black clinician. I'm so excited about this, but I think Dr. Lord's test is actually not the problem. I think Dr. Lord's test isn't the problem. The problem is that any test that that we look at like this is so subjective based on the clinician's point of view, right? So if you ask anything that's behavioral in nature and you have the child try to display behavior, it's the clinician's view, their cultural, the way they've been built culturally. And there's no view from nowhere, right? Like everything in the world I see is from the lens of a Black mother who has a kid with autism, right? And the same is true for any clinician. It's not a bad thing, but it's certainly something that can skew the ways in which these tests are scored. So her test, I've actually talked to her about her test because I have these feelings about it, and I'm at UCLA with her. So, but I argue that our test may not be the problem, but the clinicians themselves and the ways that they're thinking through Black bodies and behaviors and the tropes that they attach to us and stereotypes, they're kind of built into the way that they see Blackness are the problem.
Yeah, and the power of the story. So if you understand the story, you understand the journey, then it really clarifies how responsive you can be in a testing situation or assessment, you know?
Yeah, and I don't know if Dr. Lord's test is the problem per se, but I think Dr. Lord herself would agree that many of those tests, even the ones that she created, were created in a time and in a space where Black children and Black families were not centered. Because we know that Black families have not traditionally been a part of any of the autism, large-scale research projects until very recently. And that lots of research institutions like UCLA and other big universities have not had access even to Black families. And it's, again, until very recently that we're seeing Washington University in St. Louis, UCLA here in Los Angeles, be able to bring Black families into their clinics. But even then, because I was in, Special Needs Network is involved in a project with UCLA, WashU, to test some of these theories, they don't have Black therapists. So even the people administering the test that you're talking about, they cannot find, these organizations don't have Black and brown therapists and clinicians in. UCLA is like renowned. Dr. PJ Freeman, who was at UCLA, diagnosed my son, is diagnosed, she's the most amazing white woman on the planet. I love her to death. She's like,
I was also diagnosed by PJ Freeman.
Aunt or something.
And just to be clear,
the problem is her colleagues, they don't have, she works with Black families, and she made it her point to do that so that she could have that awareness. But if you don't go outside the four walls of these storied institutions, you will not have access to those experiences and those families.
And to be clear, if I may, the assessments are continually being revised. We started with the ADOS, now there's the ADOS 2, and just definitely that responsiveness to feedback and the needs of the community. I think the research community is definitely moving in that direction. Again, the power of the story, right? You know who you're dealing with and develop the skills by hearing voices and understanding what the needs are. And then we can work together for a better outcome for all of us.
Yeah. Jassy, last comment. I'm like, over time. This is such an interesting conversation. You guys are going to continue it in a couple of hours.
Sure. I was surprised to hear that. I'll say my comment, but just very quickly, I actually know BJ Freeman. She was the one who I saw who diagnosed me. But it's interesting, small world. But what I was going to say about when you guys were talking about code switching, as I'm interested in the use of language and how that makes you see the world, because we talk code switching in terms of people of color. But for instance, there's a big in the Autism in Adulthood, that journal. There's a whole section on camouflaging. So when we talk about, let's say, white people or get diagnosed late, we call it camouflaging. Well, people of color, we call it code switching. So what is the relationship between the two concepts?
Break that down a little for you. I'm not familiar with that term, camouflaging.
Camouflaging, it's the reason why, for instance, girls are diagnosed later than boys. One potential theory is that girls camouflage their symptoms.
They hide.
Yes, masking.
And it's called it's called also masking is another term. Masking or camouflaging. But that's usually, at least I only see that used in reference to why girls are diagnosed later than boys. I rarely see that term used in reference to people of color. It's never explained that what.
I'm sorry, I just wanted Dr. Alexander to help us understand that, because that's a little confusing for me.
I am not familiar, Jossie, to be honest, with that term being used as it relates to ethnic discussions, but definitely as it relates to gender. Girls tend more often to be diagnosed with social anxiety or being really shy, and I tend to be diagnosed later if they have less, if their autism requires less substantial support. So one of the things related to camouflaging is that a girl might demonstrate that she has developed the appropriate social behaviors. So she's smiling when she needs to, she's pleasant, but when she gets home, she's held that in for so long that she's bouncing off of the walls at home. And so that's just only one aspect of the phenomenon.
That's what makes me, that's what I'm curious about. Why don't we ever hear the term camouflaging used in reference to people of color? Why wouldn't people of color, or for instance, I even think, for instance, even the idea of camouflaging, is it really the patient's fault if the doctor misdiagnoses them? I often wonder about the perspective. It's like, wait a second, I didn't hide it. I was me. You missed it. It's like, I mean, can you imagine a doctor saying, well, I wouldn't have misdiagnosed you if you hadn't hid it from me? I mean, isn't the doctor's job to catch that stuff? I mean,
it's definitely a can of worms, Jossie. So when we do early intervention, we're teaching social skills. So you know exactly when to say good morning, you know how to take turns, because we're teaching those things. You hear people will tell you, I learned to maintain eye contact, right? So as you're getting access to these interventions, you're developing skills along the way. You bring up an interesting point that I would perhaps like to explore with people who are more knowledgeable than I am in that area about camouflaging related to culture. Definitely something new. I've not heard it before, and I'm interested in further discussion.
All right, I gotta go. My producer's gonna kill us. But I am so interested in that as well, Jossie, and thank you for raising that point. And thank you, Dr. Alexander, for saying you're gonna study it. You're gonna talk to your colleagues about it, and I'll have you all back and we can figure out if camouflaging is a thing that happens with children or young adults of color, and if we should be talking about it more, since it is a recognized phenomenon that happens with respect to girls who get diagnosed. But really interesting conversation. Again, two of the three of these folks are going to be back in conversation in a couple of hours with that incredible panel that's happening at Howard University. So if you want to follow this conversation, go to that link that's on the flyer, go to Howard's social media sites and join that conversation, because there is lots to talk about as it relates to African Americans and autism. Thank you all for your genius, for your insights, and for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I gotta go. It's been just a phenomenally exciting conversation for me as a mom of a Black boy on the spectrum. I guess he's a young man now. These conversations are so exhilarating for me. And as a leader of a nonprofit, I gotta make sure I'm on the top of my game. So talking to brilliant folks like this help me stay on top of my game. Remember, the Special Needs Network's conference is coming up this Saturday. It's free. Make sure you register. This kind of conversation is gonna continue with experts from some of the best institutions across the country. We're going to be in conversation all day. The conference starts at 7:30 with free breakfast, free lunch. There are giveaways. There's so much going on, including a dynamic talk by none other than Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. My words to live by is knowledge is power. And we are sharing and dropping so much knowledge right here at the Special Report. Be good, y'all. And remember, we're all in this together.